Thank you very much, Lawson. First place, let me say how very, very happy I am to be speaking at the Atlas Foundation. This room is full of friends and colleagues, many of whom go back more years than I like to remember, and the happy times we have had together as happy warriors are very dear to me. There is, however, a problem with the introduction I just got from Lawson, which said I was going to be talking about the new book. You got to understand that this is a book which I've had a couple of readers tell me had left them feeling suicidal after the first 6 chapters. Now, the fact is that after those first 6 chapters, things take a turn for the better in terms of my optimism. But the reason I'm not going to spend a lot of the time talking about the book is that tonight is a night of celebration, and I think there is reason to celebrate. Now, if we are looking for the libertarian revolution in the form of ballot boxes around the world which overthrow overweening states and enact Madisonian constitutions, that's not going to happen. But suppose you think about the original project of liberty as it was developed by the American founders. I think that a better way of thinking about it is not in terms of the details of a libertarian philosophy, but this very simple idea that the object was to allow people to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they allow the same freedom to everyone else. And that kind of freedom, I think, is only going to expand in the years to come. Now, let me have a caveat to everything I'm going to say. I understand how many people there are in this room who are doing wonderful work around the world in very different countries. I am not competent to speak about the situations anywhere but in the United States. So everything I say about what's going on is going to be based on my own knowledge of the United States, but I hope you will be able to take what I say, apply it to the situations that you face in your countries, and ask yourselves whether the same sources of optimism I'm going to talk about don't apply to you as well. In effect, I am saying that there are 3 transitions that are in process right now. They aren't the ordinary electoral cycles. They're longer term than that, but they are also much more powerful than simply election cycles. The first of these is a transition that's virtually over, and the battle has virtually been won, and that is the transition from an intellectual consensus that central planning was the wave of the future to an intellectual consensus that that doesn't work, and that markets do a job that could not be done and can never be done inherently by central planners for reasons that Friedrich Hayek was one of the first to describe. Well, think back to 1944, when Friedrich Hayek published The Road to Serfdom. The consensus was not only that central planning was the wave of the future, there were virtually no voices in favor of freedom at that time. And look what we have now. Oh, there's mopping up to be done. There are lots of people who look upon the value of the market as an unfortunate truth that they have to work around. They do everything they can to hobble the operations of markets, but they have to concede, and almost all have conceded, that part of the battle. The second transition alludes to something that Lawson talked about, the notion that is now very prevalent throughout the United States, that the government is no longer an extension of us. It is us versus them. The government is a thing apart, and no matter what its rhetoric might be, there is this uneasy recognition that all too often the government is primarily concerned with the health and well-being of the government. This crosses party lines. Lawson gave some examples of the statistics about the number of people who think the government may be actively harmful, going to 1996, I believe, for his first numbers to recent numbers. The statistic I like to cite involves a question that has been asked using exactly the same wording since 1958. Do you trust the government, the federal government, to do the right thing all of the time, most of the time, or only some of the time? In 1958, about 3/4 of all Americans said all of the time or most of the time. In 2013, the most recent numbers, 13%, from 74% to 13%. And by the way, that's not Barack Obama's fault. It has been falling ever since 1964. And guess what happened in 1964? The reasons for that are many and complex. I won't go into them right now. Why is it a good thing that we are now starting to look at the government as them rather than us? Because it is enabling the emergence of all sorts of strategies for what I think will be the wave of the future, which is workarounds. That we enable people to live life as they see fit, not because the government gives permission, but because we simply make it that way. Now, in the book that Lawson said I was going to talk about, I do have a solution. And that involves the Wizard of Oz, which is the actual reality of the federal government. How many people in this audience have seen the Wizard of Oz? I don't know. But the fact is, you had the villain in the movie who has this commanding, booming voice coming out of nowhere, sort of like the guy who introduced Brad Lips at the beginning of the program. Really scary. But then at the end of the movie, the curtain is pulled aside from the booth where the Wizard of Oz resides, and he is exposed as a bald, overweight old man. This is getting kind of personal, but he's not scary. Well, when the government comes after us, as individuals, we cannot fight back. There are none of us, including very wealthy people, who can afford to fight the federal government. It's just not worth it. But the federal government only gets away with that because there's no pushback. People comply without resistance. What if, when the federal government comes after a small business person for a violation of a trivial regulation, the person did no one any harm, he was just trying to provide a good or service as best he or she could. In that case, what if suddenly somebody who looks very much like Chip Miller appears out of nowhere and says, we are taking this man's case. We know he's technically guilty of your stupid regulation. We don't care. We're going to defend him, and we will use all of the resources of the legal system to make your life as miserable as possible. We're also, among other things, going to publicize your name, something bureaucrats really don't like, I have been told recently. And we're also going to reimburse any fine you levy at the end of the whole process. Suppose you had occupational defense funds that did the same things for veterinarians or plumbers or physicians or whatever, so that a bureaucrat who goes after a member of the public for this huge cloud of regulations that beset us like gnats, suppose there was pushback and the bureaucrat actually had to say, do I really want to take this on? That's possible. It's doable. And it's doable because even though the rule of law is really important, when that rule of law has been corrupted, as it has been corrupted in the United States, it is not just the right, but it is the duty of the citizenry to take arms against it. There are a variety of other ways in which we, the people, and that, by the way, includes a lot of people on the left, are seeing ways in which they can work around the government. 4 letters, U-B-E-R, Uber. Who would have thought 15 years ago that there was any way to break into the monopolies that have been created jointly by the taxi companies and city councils? Well, it turns out you do not supplicate, You do not get into bed with them. You just show up in the city and start offering your service, and by the time they mount their opposition to you, you're already so popular that there's a political price to be paid for regulating you. And it also turns out And it also turns out that Uber has real deep pockets, so don't think you can intimidate them. But there are other kinds of things which are showing the obsolescence of government. There was a rationale in 1910 for the government to take a role in inspection of meat or in lots of kinds of regulation, because it really was hard for sellers to get accurate information on market prices in lots of rural places in the United States. It really was hard to know what was in the products that you were buying. It really was hard to get any redress if you ran into a shyster. There was a rationale in 1910. That rationale is utterly gone. The availability of knowledge through the internet is such that nobody ever goes to a government website to find out whether a restaurant or a purveyor of services or anything else is good. You go to your fellow Americans who, through the IT revolution, are giving us access to that kind of information. There is the sclerosis of government. The simple recognition, and when I talk about government being sclerotic, I'm calling on the work of Mansur Olson, a great economist, who talked about the ways in which advanced democracies simply grind to a halt in terms of their ability to respond effectively to problems. Add to that the systemic corruption in the current political process, not because people are taking bribes, but because it now operates, Washington now operates operationally, indistinguishably from a kleptocracy in a Central Asian or Sub-Saharan African kleptocratic government. The way that it actually works operationally is pretty much the same. All of these things are leading to a situation in which we don't get rid of government, but government isn't really that adept at opposing us anymore. And so you have this strange kind of paradox. The political process is hopeless. In Silicon Valley, the employees of Google go to the polls and they return for that county in California very large majorities for whatever liberal Democrat happens to be running for office that year. And those same Google employees then go back to work the next morning, creating all these ways in which we can get along without government and all these ways in which we are subverting government. The facts on the ground are that even though the political process is broken, the things that are creating crevices and cracks in ways to increase freedom are all thriving. The third transition is, in my view, the most important. And many of you in this room have heard me speak about it or read me write about it for a quarter of a century now. But that's the transition from the defense of freedom in terms of first principles, which is perfectly valid, to a defense of freedom, or perhaps more appropriately, an offense for freedom based on human flourishing. There is too broad a perception, sometimes within the liberty movement itself, but certainly among our opposition, that freedom is just fine for people who are lucky enough to be smart or lucky enough to have money, and that's what limited government is good for, but we've got to worry about the rest of the people who need to be taken care of. The reality is that to construct a meaningful human life, a life that lets you reach the age I'm at and look back on who you've been and what you've done and take satisfaction in it, is the result of what you did within a very few domains, namely 4 domains. Those 4 domains are family, faith, community, and vocation. You don't have to be deeply engaged in all 4. There are happy atheists and there are happy single people, but you better be engaged in at least 2 and better 3 or even better 4. in order to live a satisfying life, because those are the arenas in which you spend your life doing important things. Raising a family is really an important thing. Being a member of a community solving problems with your neighbors is important. And the same is true of vocation and faith. But all of those domains need to be left alone if they are to be rich and vital sources of satisfaction. The family has to be responsible for getting things done that won't get done unless the family does it. Communities have to be responsible for doing things that won't get done unless the community does it. And whenever the government says, never mind, we'll take the trouble out of that, it is in effect denuding the sources of satisfaction in human lives, and this is every bit as true of somebody who is working on a loading dock at a low-paying job as it is true of a hedge fund manager in New York, and actually probably maybe a lot more true. The biggest misunderstanding, I think, on the part of the left about freedom is when we talk about people needing to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. That's not the price of freedom, that's the reward. We take responsibility for the consequences of our actions, and in doing so, we infuse our lives with something more important than having spent the time here on earth, passing the time as pleasantly as possible. So as we start to make that case, that the reason why we need freedom is not to lower marginal tax rates, it's not to enable people who already have a lot of money to make more. It is to enable all people to pursue happiness in the ways that the founders had in mind. To the extent we can make that transition, we will have won the war altogether. And so I'm optimistic. Am I optimistic about what's going to happen in the next 5 or 7 years? No, not necessarily. There are lots of ways in which things may get worse in certain respects rather than better. But I'm really optimistic over the course of the next century or two. I simply cannot imagine. I know you're all thinking about Keynes, okay? In the long term, we're all dead. In a funny kind of way, that doesn't matter. The worst thing is to be engaged in a cause which you think is going to fail. And in terms of the fight for freedom, one of the problems that I think we have had is to be overwhelmed by the odds against us. What I'm saying tonight is, no, actually, the force is with us. It's just going to take a while. It's not going to happen on its own, however. And that is why I'm especially glad to be speaking to this group, where we have so many people scattered throughout this room who are engaged in sometimes the very beginning efforts in your own countries to make these ideas come to fruition. Because even though we have the forces with us that will eventually enable us to achieve victory, it is not going to happen by itself. The task of doing it falls to you, the people in this room. And for that, for your willingness to take that upon your shoulders, I thank you, I applaud you, and I salute you. Thank you very much.